what to you, as a critic of Trump, what to you are the pros, the strengths of Donald Trump, and what to you are his biggest weaknesses?
The strengths of Trump, let's see how I can frame them in a way that is both accurate and accurately assesses my feeling about it.
And can be taken out of context most masterfully through the clipping process.
Yes. Trump's strengths are mostly superficial and in terms of presentation. Trump was able to, I call it a grift. Some on the right say he's just so good at relating to different types of people. Trump, as a rich guy from New York City, was able to convince people that he spent most of his life trying to be kept isolated from, that he had their best interests in mind, that he knew why they weren't doing well in the 2016 economy, and that he had solutions that he was going to bring forward. The truth is, he never really liked those people. And as soon as they weren't useful to him for a brief period of time, that love affair with his followers stopped. And then now it's back that he needs them again. He didn't really understand the causes of the problems that those folks were experiencing. And his solutions were laughable, right? Like Jared was going to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in year one. He was going to replace Obamacare in 2017, things that were never going anywhere. But what he did really well was he put up a united front of, I know what is ailing you. I know how to fix it. And I know how to fix it, I guess, because he's a businessman and he's been above the fray of politics for so long, knowing how to use political donations to his advantage. He called that smart, et cetera. I think that's his greatest strength.
Why do you say that the Jared plan for Israel and Palestine and the plan for healthcare to improve Obamacare, why do you say that's laughable?
Well, only someone, I would include the North Korea plan as well, which I'm glad to talk about. Only someone who doesn't know anything about the size and scope of these issues could so arrogantly say that they could solve them in that way and on that time frame. I'm all for optimism and bringing a new face to things, absolutely, without a doubt. But, a wall with Mexico that Mexico will pay for at the end of my first term. I know there are people who believed it because they would call into my show and say, I'm voting for Trump because of it. But it's hard to believe that anybody serious would fall for that unless you were deliberately wanting to just believe whatever was being fed to you, or you just hadn't ever thought about these issues before. The healthcare plan, in 2017, they proposed one, would have led to 24 million or so people ending up without healthcare. Didn't go anywhere because it was so terrible. And then in August of 2020, Trump said, in 2 weeks, I'm going to finally have my healthcare proposal. It's 2023. We still never got it. With all of these things, when you think them through, it was just sort of arrogance. And I get the perspective of, I want optimism, and I liked that optimism. Mm-hmm. It worked. I mean, fair. A lot of people saw it and liked it. As someone who followed a lot of those issues closely, they seemed, of course, like impossible promises.
Well, it's a double-edged sword. So to push back a little bit, if you look at the things I have a little bit more knowledge about, which is the space of artificial intelligence, there's a company called DeepMind and there's a company called OpenAI that were laughed at for a long time when they were talking about that they're going to solve intelligence. And now they've made, especially DeepMind, and now most recently OpenAI with GPT, they've made progress that most of the AI community would not have imagined they'd be able to make. Everything from AlphaGo beating the world Go champion, just all the different steps in progress that I can get into were surprised everybody. And they are legitimately, fearlessly pursuing the task of solving intelligence. The other aspect, he gets a lot of criticism now, but another example is Elon Musk. I can say a lot of things like SpaceX, so commercial space flight. He was laughed at for a long time that that's possible. Same thing with autopilot in Tesla, autonomous vehicles. His approach was harshly criticized by all the experts and still criticized, to this day, deeply criticized. And I, as a person that I believe objectively can look at the progress of autopilot as a semi-autonomous vehicle system, has been incredibly surprising. So the reason I mention that is sometimes it feels like you need the guy or the gal who makes those preposterous, ambitious statements like, we're going to solve healthcare this year. Like, and then there's experts like yourself that are looking, thinking, have you read anything about the history of this? Israel Palestine is a good example of that. Do you know there's a history there? Do you realize how complicated, how many people have tried, how many people have failed, how many millions of people hate each other in this little place, in this land? Like, sometimes the expertise can really weigh you down. So it's sort of to push back. Sometimes you have to have almost be naive and stupid and just rush in with an optimism in order to actually make some progress.
I agree with you 100%. I think it's interesting that all of the examples you gave of successes are from the technology space.
Not politics, yes.
Not from politics, which, I mean, listen,
Yeah.
I would love to be able to make headway on some of these issues more quickly, without a doubt. I do think at some point, though, when it comes down to voting and saying one of these people is going to be ostensibly in charge for 4 years through all of the departments and secretaries and choices that they make, we do want to apply some level of realism with the understanding that your examples are from the tech space, and they're good examples. There's no question about it. One thing I'll add to this, I recently read Bradley Hope's new book about North Korea, and it's really about an activist who... It doesn't even really matter, but in the background of the book, it's written, much of what is written about happens during the Trump era, and when Trump did the first and then the second, I guess you'd call them summits with Kim Jong-un. And it actually did seem like, to some degree, Trump's, we're going to handle this like I do a business deal approach to Kim Jong-un. In some sense, it actually was logical, because of Kim Jong-un and the way that it was so ego-driven, and they both, as sort of authoritarian strongmen types to different degrees, wanted that. There was actually a kernel where I actually thought, as I read it, Trump's initial idea wasn't crazy. The problem was he knew nothing about the backstory of the relationship. He fell for all sorts of lies from Kim Jong-un, and he made offers that didn't make any sense to make. It fell apart, fine. But that's an example where I think Trump's personality was not actually, at its base, the problem when it came to North Korea.
Well, there's other things of this nature that could go in, or some people argue goes into the strengths and pros of Donald Trump. For China, for example, tariffs on China. Can you make the case that there's some positive outcomes of the way Donald Trump acted with China?
It's really tough. And I'll give you a couple reasons.
Okay, then
why.
Also cons.
I'll give you, it's tough to make. So the China thing is really, so just very recently to when we're recording this, Trump was on Fox News interviewed by a guy named Mark Levin. And Trump proposed a new, I call it a conspiracy theory, maybe it will strike you as something different, about China, COVID, and tariffs. And Trump's suggestion was that the tariffs cost China so much money, China sent the US so much money in tariffs, that they released COVID as punishment. Now, there's a couple problems with that. One, American companies pay the tariffs. Trump still doesn't seem to know this. Trump seems to believe that when he puts a tariff on Chinese imports, someone in China is cutting a check to the United States. American companies buy the stuff from China, and then American companies cut a check to the United States for the tariff. Trump doesn't seem to get that.
But it still has a sting to the Chinese economy.
You can make the argument that if there is a suitable alternative domestically or from a different country, that it will reduce imports, but it didn't happen. And we actually have reports now that the tariffs on China cost about 250,000 American jobs. The other problem with that idea is China created and released a virus in order to hurt you, but as of today, 5.7 of the 6.8 million deaths were in other countries. It's a very indirect way. You're mostly killing people in other countries to hurt Trump. Maybe there was this is the sort of thing where when I think about how Trump dealt with China, it's very scary, because given another 4 years, who knows what he might do if he still doesn't understand how tariffs work.
So geopolitics operates in complicated ways with carrots and sticks. And Henry Kissinger has written quite a lot about this. And in some sense, the positive aspect here that Donald Trump is willing to take big risks in the game of geopolitics with this giant superpower that is China, and a lot of others are too afraid to call them out, to come to the table and criticize.
I certainly think that's an argument that can be made. My question would be, what tangible positive outcomes did it lead to? And it's tough to identify any, but I think it's a great thing. I mean, listen, one of the things you're kind of getting at, maybe indirectly, is that there's been this sense that politics has been done very similarly for a long time. And even between Democrats and Republicans, still, even with some policy differences, there's still the kind of feeling that it's disconnected folks in DC, mostly dealing with issues that don't directly affect. Look, I get that. I'm with you on that. I think the question as to whether Trump's bluster was positive rather than extraordinarily humiliating in many ways, I just come down on it was an absolute and total humiliation. But I understand that you can recognize Trump doesn't know a lot of stuff, but his attitude was refreshing in some way. That's a reasonable position for someone to take. I disagree with it, but I understand it.
But is trying and failing better than not trying?
This goes well beyond politics. You know, Wayne Gretzky has weighed in about this. Michael Jordan has weighed in about. I mean, this is Is it better to have tried and failed than never? Is it better to have loved and lost than never to have loved? I don't know. I mean, listen, we lived through 4 years of Trump. We know what that 4-year term was like, and it's very hard for me to say that the things he tried were overwhelmingly reasonable. But I get the point you're trying to make, and I appreciate it. And it's, if we don't do any of it, then where do we end up? Sure. We know where we ended up with Trump, and it was pretty embarrassing.
Okay, let's linger on some more strengths. We didn't start any new wars.
We didn't.
Is there something to that?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a few different approaches to dealing with that. First, it's really important to remember that the counterpoint to that from the folks who like to say that was that Hillary Clinton was going to start 3 wars. Sometimes they say 4 wars. Sometimes they say 5 wars. Okay. The geopolitical situation during the 4 years that Trump was in office, I don't know that they obviously lent themselves to wars that Trump just barely was able to keep us out of. I think the Russia thing is interesting because now it's very popular to go back and say, you know, the reason Putin didn't do the Ukraine thing when Trump, right? And to somehow give Trump credit for that. There's a counterpoint to it, which is Putin under Trump, particularly if Trump got 4 more years, would have been able to maybe consolidate power in other ways because of his relationship with Trump. I'm not coming down on one side or the other. It's not my area of expertise, but it's not the open shut slam dunk that, you know, Trump likes to say it is. Putin didn't invade because he knew I would crush him. And, okay. So it's not obvious to me that there were imminently wars that would have started during that time. That being said, you know, for all the criticism of Obama during Crimea, Trump seemed to just kind of forget about that after all the criticism and say, I'm not actually going to do anything about that. And so there are foreign policy criticisms that could be made, but it is true. No new wars were started under Trump. And I like that. I don't like wars.
What do you think about his handling of COVID? Can you say, what are the pros and cons of his handling of COVID?
The con for him is he'd be president right now if he had handled it differently. I think it's abundantly clear. Early on, and there's now a lot of really good reporting about the conversations he was having with Jared Kushner and others, he became convinced, either because of things he was being told or because he decided this is the way it's going to be, this is going to go away. Fine, it's in China. Okay, it's in China and Italy. Okay, we have 15 cases, but it'll soon be 0. We'll be open by Easter of 2020. Mm-hmm. None of it happened. If he had handled it in the following way, and I've said this to Rogan and I've said this to Patrick Bet-David, and they tend to all see my side of this. If Trump had said, listen, we don't know how bad this is going to be, but I care too much about the American people to take a shot. So it's not going to be 2 weeks. It's going to be a little bit, but I need your help We're going to bring everybody together. I don't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican. We're going to have MAGA masks, and he could have kept 50 cents on the dollar to pay off Stormy or whoever, right? But it would have been, I think he wins re-election because the perception was, and reality is a version of that, the perception was that he was way too cavalier about it early on. People died who didn't need to die. And I think that it was arguably the one area where he could have all but guaranteed that he was going to get himself reelected.
Well, to push back on that, I mean, because you mentioned sort of masks and lockdowns kind of a solution to COVID.
I didn't mention lockdowns, but I'm glad to talk about policy.
Sure, quarantine or like, but there's several solutions to a pandemic, broadly speaking.
Sure.
And one of them is a vaccine. And so you didn't mention that. He fast-tracked the development. His administration fast-tracked the development of the vaccine, which surprisingly he didn't really take much credit for.
I think he did. I think he tried. There's a lot there.
Well, to me, it seems like you could make the case with the Trump hand gestures that his decisions for fast-tracking the development of the vaccine saved tens of millions of lives. He could, in the Trumpian way, make that case.
So, a couple different things. I know you don't necessarily follow Trump's rallies as closely as I do, and I'm jealous of you for that. But he did tout the vaccine stuff hugely for a while, until his audience turned against him. And then he had to draw this line where he was going, I made the vaccines, which none of you have to take, by the way. Freedom. You don't have to take them. But it's fantastic. And nobody else could have done it. But don't worry, nobody's going to make you take the vaccine. And he actually got booed at a couple of his own rallies when talking about the vaccines. But let's back up a little bit. Fast tracking. My understanding of what he did is he did what any president in his situation would do and what many world leaders elsewhere did as well, which is he agreed to pre-purchase supply of vaccine in order to provide money to pharmaceutical companies to scale up the manufacturing, which is absolutely fine. But he wants, one of the stories he tells is, it usually takes 12 years to develop a vaccine. We did it in 9 months, thanks to me. Decades of mRNA technology being developed created the platform in which you can make a particular vaccine in 9 months. It didn't have anything to do with Trump. He did pre-fund and say, we will buy huge supply, and that provided liquidity to the pharmaceutical companies.
But he also delegated control to people, to experts that enable that kind of fast tracking of vaccines, right?
He was very eager for the FDA to approve it because he saw that there would be a political benefit.
And he didn't get in the way, I guess.
He didn't get in the way. Fair. I think now we're on the same page. He did not get in the way of vaccines being developed, which is good.
Presidents and bureaucracies have a way of getting in the way. And
I don't disagree with that. I'm not aware of really any governments that got in the way. I mean, it seemed, given the global situation, European countries were pre-purchasing vaccine. African countries who were going to be later to receive vaccines were partnering with the European countries that had pre-purchased. But the most interesting thing about all of this is Trump did play up the vaccines for a long time until his crowd didn't want to hear about it anymore, which was crazy. It was sort of like he became a victim of the monster he created to some degree.
One of the effects of all this that makes me truly sad is this division over the vaccines has created distrust in science.
Yeah.
And also what makes me sad is the scientific leaders, Anthony Fauci being one of the representatives of that community, I would say completely dropped the ball.
In what way?
They spoke with arrogance. They spoke down to people. They spoke in a way that a great scientist does not speak, which is they spoke with certainty, without humility, like they have all the wisdom and all of us are too dumb to understand it, but they're going to be the parent that tells us exactly what to do, versus speaking to the immensity of the problem, the deep core of the problem being the uncertainty. We don't know what to do. The terrifying thing about the pandemic, we don't know anything about it as it's happening. And so you have to make decisions. You have to take risks about, well, maybe you have to overreact in order to protect the populace. But it's in the face of uncertainty they have to do that, not not empowered by science somehow, and the deep expertise that somebody like Anthony Fauci claims to have. So like I'm really troubled by the distrust in science that resulted from that, and that you have to blame the leaders. I mean, to the degree leaders take responsibility, and I think Anthony Fauci was the scientific leader behind the American response to the pandemic, and I think he failed as a scientist, as a representative of science.
I'm less, I don't know if interested is the right word, but the kind of the Fauci review is less interesting to me in terms of what comes next than the first part you mentioned, which is the distrust in science. And sometimes I'll get voicemails or emails from people in my audience who say that I have had to backpedal on certain things related to this. And one of the things I tried to do from the beginning was not speak in certain terms when we really didn't have complete information. So there was this period where hydroxychloroquine was first sort of mentioned as a possible treatment, prophylactic or proactive treatment for COVID, or active treatment for COVID, along with a bunch of other stuff. There was ivermectin, there was vitamin D, there were all sorts of different things. And I tried to be careful to say, right now, we don't have rigorous science that tells us that some of these things work. It doesn't mean that won't come in the future. At which point, if there was something as cheap as hydroxychloroquine that treated COVID effectively, unbelievable, fantastic. It's not, there's no way it ever will be determined. We don't have that information right now. So it's not super wise right now to go and start taking this stuff. We eventually learned, like with vitamin D, having an appropriate vitamin D level does seem to be, based on what I've most recently read, generally protective and a good thing when it comes to infections of different. Great. Okay, so that one we figured out. One of the really difficult things is that the quote truth about the vaccines did change. And the original, again, this is all, I don't pretend to be an expert, but just someone who's synthesizing the medical data and writing about it. Originally, the first vaccine related to the wild type strain did seem to be very effective, not only at preventing death and serious illness, but also transmission. There were people then saying it doesn't prevent transmission. Over time, as the variants came forward, the vaccine became less effective at that. At that point, I started telling my audience something different because, as far as I was concerned, the reality on the ground had changed. In my mind, that's how science works. It's not backpedaling. It's we're adjusting our beliefs to what is taking place in the real world.
Well, to be fair, the scientists, many of whom are my friends, virologists and biologists, they have way more humility than people like Anthony Fauci who are speaking about this, or the CEO of Pfizer who are speaking about this. This is the fundamental problem here, is the way science works is there's usually a lot more humility and a lot more transparency about what we know and what we don't know. And people like Anthony Fauci thought it would be beneficial for the world if he speaks with more certainty. But because of the political division that formed around that, that certainty resulted in, became completely counterproductive. That people didn't trust anything about the vaccine, didn't trust any institutions there were that contained the experts that actually knew what they were doing, and basically didn't trust anything that was coming out of the mouths of scientists. Some large percent of the population. So that made you completely ineffective in at scale as a society trying to respond to a terrible pandemic. And that's where I put a lot of blame on leaders. So political leaders and scientific leaders are the ones that should inspire us to all get together and respond. And that should be the case for the pandemic. That should be the case in a time of war, all this kind of stuff.
I generally agree with you. And for me, it's really about shared blame. And there were a lot of different reasons why the early communication wasn't good. Part of it was, I mean, for me, I prefer accuracy rather than overconfidence. I would prefer, listen, we don't really know right now whether masks do X or Y. What we do know is the supply is really limited of this type of mask. We're going to try to keep them for the frontline workers. I love that. That's the way I want to be communicated to. A call was made to do it differently, which was to say the masks don't actually help. But the real reason is they want to keep them for healthcare workers. And then later, the masks are what's going to solve. I'm with you 100%. I think the other layer to it is you can't ignore the political situation at the time. If Trump had won re-election and the vaccine distribution had taken place while Trump was president rather than Biden, my belief is that the same number of Democrats would have gotten vaccinated, but way more Republicans would have as well, because they were following not science, but political leaders. And when it was Biden in DC instead of Trump, a lot of those people said, I don't trust the vaccine. But wait, it's Trump's vaccine, I thought. Yeah, but something about the way Biden's distributing it. So I do think you can't ignore that political layer. I agree with you. The communication was a disaster.